Hi, this is Paul, and this is going to be a long one. It's going to be a long one because we are going to talk about what we are talking about when we talk about God or when we use the word God. Last week or so, Esther O'Reilly opened up her column on pathos called Young Fogey. She's an evangelical, and actually she and I have been writing quite a bit back and forth. And I thought it was a great piece, and even Jordan Peterson saw the piece and wrote, "This is a good article," and the piece was entitled, "Sam Harris Asks Questions Jordan Peterson Can't Answer." And it was a great piece. And then Gordy Allen writes, "Great read. Instead of belief or non-belief, now the conversation's moved on to a much more interesting question. What do you mean when you say God?" And that's taken directly from the piece where Esther says, now here's the question of the hour. What are we talking about when we talk about God? A few weeks ago, I did a video entitled Jordan Peterson's Axiomatic God versus Sam Harris's Anti-Masturbation God. These two are defining God in very different ways, and Sam Harris calls Jordan Peterson on this and says, this isn't the definition of God that most people have. Well, true. It's the definition of God that Jordan Peterson uses, that he trotted out in the Lafayette conversation where he answered the student's question, your religion or God are the axioms that you act upon. And this gets back into these two views of reality. Jordan Peterson at the beginning of Maps of Meaning says reality can be construed in two different ways. You can imagine reality to be a space for objects, or reality is best conceived as a form for action, and his pragmatism shows through that. For Peterson, your God is implicit, or your implicit axioms that you act out of, and your true beliefs are not necessarily revealed by what you say about yourself or even by what you think about yourself, but by how you behave. And of course, Sam Harris subscribes to the other conception of reality and is terribly offended every time Jordan Peterson says, you're really a Christian deep down, and Sam Harris says, am not. But now, when I look at normal people look like Verizon Lisa. Verizon Lisa is standing outside of the Verizon store, and the universe is telling her to get a new cell phone, and the universe is telling her that she looks nice today. And Verizon Lisa is very happy with this. She doesn't say God because, well, we're in a cultural context where belief in God is, oh, you might be a bigot or a homophobe or something like that if you believe in God. So instead, and this is fashionable in our time, and I hear it all the time in Northern California, talk to the universe instead, because then you can detach your religious commitments from this history of bigotry and patriarchy and white supremacy that we call Christianity. And so now we'll just treat universe like God and everything will be cool. You can keep your morality and your religion all nicely in one place. I think, however, if Sam Harris was standing outside of the Verizon store with Verizon Lisa would get a scolding from Sam Harris and say, no, it's not the universe telling you to get a smartphone. It's not the universe telling you you look nice today. That's your own imagination inside your head. Consciousness is a beautiful thing. You can meditate and take psychedelics and have very different experiences of consciousness, but it's all in your head. There's Sam Harris's credo. There's Sam Harris's religion, if you will. But I think Esther O'Reilly really nailed it. What do you mean when you say God? Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris mean two different things, and even with their 4 conversations, I don't know that they got past that. I think Brett Weinstein really tried to help them get past it, and I'll redo some of the slides that I did in my axiomatic God video. Meaning of God number 1. This actually is a new slide. So I'm just going to use number 1 and number 2 because just to try to keep things clear for the sake of this video. Meaning of God number 1. I think we have the broader ancient God, generic God, Elohim in the Old Testament. That is the source of all, governs all, and is in all. In him we live and move or have our being. The Apostle Paul even quotes some pagans when he says that, when that is quoted of him in the book of Acts. It balances all the equations in the universe. It's kind of like dark matter. When there are things we don't know what to figure out, we just punt it into God. God is, in a sense, that way, the kitchen sink, and all of these nasty problems, we can kind of attribute it to him. People don't worry about the fact that Idi Amin and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao all seem to escape justice in this world. You know, God will hold them to account. And even people who don't go to church or aren't very religious at all, you will see them invoking hell on people that they believe deserve judgment, but this world has never actually called them to account. God is simply too handy to have around to get rid of now. And so what tends to happen with these conversations with Sam Harris is that if you press Sam Harris on, did Chairman Mao get away with it? What will Sam Harris say? He has to say Chairman Mao got away with it. Pol Pot got away with it. Joseph Stalin got away with it. Adolf Hitler got away with it. Doesn't that incentivize future tyrants to see what they can do to get away with it? If no tribunal or earthly court catches you, you're going to get away with it. Doesn't this, is it simply our pride? We don't want to be a bad person that's going to keep us from evil? These are questions that haunt this. And so this is part of the reason God or the universe or karma is so handy to keep around, just emotionally for people. Now, this God, number one, is rather impersonal. Pantheists don't object. And so you can keep this God in kind of a new agey way or a pantheistic way. You can keep this God around, and God can be the force. God can be a power. You can have the light side and the dark side of the force, so on and so forth. This is a God that people don't mind keeping around. We speak of it as if it has agency, not unlike the way we talk about genes wanting something. Okay, your genes want this. You will hear legitimate atheistic biologists say, like Brett Weinstein or Richard Dawkins, this is what your genes want. Well, what do you mean want? Well, we're talking telos or an impersonalized desire when we use the language in that way. That's the assassin robots. This is in some way the God of philosophers. This is God number one. Now, God number two, well, now we're getting into the God that Sam Harris doesn't like. The named Lord of the Hebrews. So in the Bible, for those of you who don't know, if you are reading a pretty standard English text, most of the time you will see God. This is a Bible given to me, actually. I don't prefer the translation, but people, New American Standard, it's perfectly legitimate. If you read a contemporary text, a contemporary edition of the Bible, you will, in the Old Testament, you will see the word God, which will usually stand for Elohim. Or you will see the Lord, which will stand for the Tetragrammaton, or Yahweh, or the various ways, Hashem, or the various ways that the religious groups say it. And you will notice again and again that the Lord is one and God is the other. God is what the Lord is. Okay, it's not another name for him, but there's differentiation between Elohim, and there's a very complex backstory of Elohim in terms of the scriptures. But the Lord is the God of the Hebrews, and that God is distinct from Baal or Marduk or Hadad or Molech or any of the other gods of the surrounding nations. This God claims supremacy and more. This God gets involved in history and has opinions and tells people what to do and what not to do. This God makes claims without embarrassment, and he will take people's lives without apology. This God claims the right to do as he pleases without needing to justify himself, although he's not above demonstrating his righteousness to Satan. You can read that in the book of Job. So you have God number one and God number two. Now, God number one is governing context, okay? It's fairly impersonal, but He's very handy in terms of keeping justice and lots of things working in terms of our psychology and our sociology and social lubrication between people. God number one is governing context. God number two is personal and interactive. All right? Now, Jordan Peterson's God is very much God number one, if you read his axioms. This God is simply too handy not to have around. Atheists like Sam Harris are simply naive to imagine, Jordan Peterson would say, to imagine denying God number one. Their notion of ontology removes him from human civilization. He's saying, well, Jordan, we want you to answer the question, do you believe in God? And Jordan says, depends what you mean by God. Yeah, depends what he means by God. Is God a construct? Is God like Santa Claus? Jonathan Peugeot just recently did a video on God being like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, because this is often trotted out by atheists. Well, Santa Claus is real. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, Santa Claus governs stuff. Mickey Mouse is real. Mickey Mouse is in fact so real, the Disney Corporation keeps pumping plenty of money into the political system to keep Mickey Mouse out of public domain. Why? He's real enough. He's real enough to govern the actions of the lawyers of the Disney Corporation. Mickey Mouse is real. Does that mean that there's a little mouse named Mickey? Well, there's lots of little mice named Mickey. Does that mean that Steamboat Willie is a historical rendering of the relationship between a mouse and a riverboat? Well, this God is real enough to govern history. And now Sam Harris will say, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. But Jordan Peterson says, you imagine you can dispose of this God and get rid of him at your peril. Let's look at Jordan Peterson's axioms that I lifted from one of these bootleg takes. I'm looking for the better recording to come out so I can make a few corrections in them. God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time as the most real aspects of existence, manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects within the here and now. What that means is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical or metaphorical structure as a consequence of the process of evolution that over unbelievably vast expanses of time and it structures your perceptions of reality in ways that we wouldn't be structured if you'd only lived for the amount of time you were going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts because you're evanescent and you can't derive values from the fact that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that is 3.5 billion years old. This is a terribly important quote because in many ways, if you can unpack this is Jordan Peterson's most interesting religious argument right here, that the God, regardless of the ontology that in the way Sam Harris keeps thinking about him, this God is governing the world. And he's into our biology, and he's into our texts, and he's into our dreams, and he's into our stories, and he's into our past, and he will govern the future. This God is around, and that doesn't satisfy Sam Harris. Well, because Sam Harris has a very different idea in his head what God is and what God should be. More axioms from Jordan Peterson. God is that which is eternally died and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being. Truth. That's fundamentally an element of the hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. God is what calls and responds in the internal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. That's how God gets into our biology, because God is doing the selecting in mating up. Now you might think, Well, those silly Christians, they're sitting there praying to God, asking God, Lord, send me the right wife or send me the right husband. Jordan Peterson says he's been doing that forever because God is in the hierarchies. And you thinking, well, God showed me to marry him or God showed me to marry her. And Jordan Peterson says God's throughout your biology, and you are interested in this person, not that person, based on biology that has been cooking in us for 3.5 billion years. God is all throughout this place, okay? You're not going to get rid of him. That's what Jordan Peterson is saying. Men arrange themselves into hierarchies and rise in the hierarchy, and there's principles that are important, and that determines the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power. They are something like the ability to articulate truth, and the ability to be competent, and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and you will radically increase your reproductive fitness, and the operation of that across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women. Women peel off the top of the male hierarchy. The question is, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? The answer right now is tyranny is part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates over tremendous expanses of time and plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality. And Sam Harris interrupts him and says, crap, you're full of it, Jordan. Harris asserts that Jordan Peterson is using a different definition of God, and Harris has a point. Jordan Peterson says God number one is real enough. Again, see Pajot's Santa Claus video. To have become foundational for our civilization. God has his fingerprints all over you, and God was involved in who you chose to be your wife, Sam Harris, and who your wife, and that your wife chose you, Sam Harris. In other words, Sam, God brought you together even though you and your wife didn't sit down and say, Lord, who should I marry? You should marry Sam. Harris says, I'm not interested in that. That's not the kind of God I want to talk about. I want to eliminate the kind of religious practice that is about God number two. Okay, Sam, but tell us about God number one. Clearly, Jordan Peterson makes you nervous. Clearly, Jordan Peterson thinks Sam Harris is naive. That's the heart of this conversation, spaced over, what do we got, 10, 12, 14 hours of these two guys talking out in public? This is the conversation. It's all right here. Sam Harris is anti-masturbation God. You've swapped the traditional definition of God that everyone believes for your axiomatic God. Sam Harris says, I wish he would say this more clearly. I don't want to talk about God number one. I just want to talk about God number two. That's the only God I care about. Traditional God cares if you masturbate. Traditional God is a personal God who hears and answers prayer. Sam Harris doesn't know that there are at least two meanings for God. Sam Harris doesn't know this? Of course he knows this. Why can't you see this in this conversation? Why can't you two sit down and say, here's my definition of God. Here's my definition of God. Here's the thing that bugs Sam Harris about Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson says, I know this God is real, God number one. I'm open to God number two. And Sam Harris, in his mission of sorts, is saying, no, you must not be open to God number two. There's the debate right there. Then Brett Weinstein stuns the show and says, I do not believe in a supernatural God. And again, I'm going to have to do a video on this word supernatural all by itself. But the God I just heard Jordan Peterson describe, I do not have any difficulty understanding why he might care if you masturbate, and don't have any trouble figuring out how he might answer prayer. This seems to stun the crowd, and Sam Harris starts to stutter. He says, tell me more. Well, Brett Weinstein clearly understands what Jordan Peterson is talking about with God number one. But Jordan Peterson still makes Brett Weinstein nervous because of his openness to God number two. And that is, of course, what excites all of the religious people. Now, people imagine different gods. Duh. Polytheism was one way of managing multiple representations of multiple gods. In a sense, what polytheism does is that everyone put their gods on the table. This is my God, this is your God. And socially, they said everybody can have their own God as long as what? As long as in the Roman Empire, as long as you respect and do your obeisance to the god of the empire, or the god of your polis, or the god of your town, or the god of your family, or your ancestral worship. There's always something that impinges. Now, the Jews got let off the hook for that. The Christians became then a gray area, not Jewish enough to qualify for the Jewish exception, and that then put the Christians in competition with paganism, a competition which Christianity eventually triumphed over. Monotheism puts the gods in a hierarchy. Monotheism manages in a very different way. Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have a fair amount of overlap in terms of, we can throw the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses in there, and maybe the Baha'i and a bunch of other groups. There's a fair amount of overlap, but you can get Christians and Muslims arguing and Jews arguing pretty fiercely over who is God and what are his qualities. But now, most of that overlap is God number one. So when you get into God number two, that it really gets interesting. Now, Harris talks about Hinduism, and I'm not an expert on Hinduism, but I'm not sure Harris is right here, because it's important to remember that this word Hinduism didn't really get going until the British made India a colony. In fact, what we now call India today was a whole group of rival kingdoms that the British eventually were able to kind of piece together. And so, kind of a combination between the British and Gandhi, you get Hinduism. But I've talked to a number of Hindus, and is it one religion? Well, is it one God? Well, everything is God, and all of these individual manifestations of God are really manifestations of the one God, or being. It is a very different conception than the God of the Hebrews as it comes through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But the question of polytheism, monotheism, it's a different system, and so is Hinduism monotheistic? Kind of. Is it polytheistic? Kind of. What it isn't is very well organized, and I think functionally they tend to use the polytheistic social mechanisms to keep that going, and that is part of the appeal of contemporary polytheisms today, and in some ways kind of the secular compromise that was reached and practiced first in the United States and then throughout a lot of the West has some similarities to that polytheistic approach. You can have any god you want, but keep it personal. So we have a public space and a private space, and that tends to be how we've worked on it in the United States. But now, how do we characterize Jordan Peterson? Now, he got attention from the Orthodox through Peugeot, who befriended him before Jordan Peterson's status rocket ride, through his mythological symbolism. And Peugeot heard Peterson talking about this and thought, wow, this is really helpful stuff. But Jordan Peterson doesn't seem ready to start the rigorous path of becoming an Orthodox catechumen. Now, if you want to join your local Baptist church, just come one Sunday and say, "Pastor, baptize me." And the pastor, well, I don't want to be too hard on the Baptists, but a lot of Baptists, you can get baptized pretty fast. Certain other traditions, like my own, well, you're going to probably have to study the catechism a little bit, okay, and get to know that a little bit. Other traditions, like the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, you're not just going to walk into this room and join this church just like that. We want you to train. We want you to agree to some things. It's more than just, "Pastor, I want to be saved." Boosh, in the water. It's, here's the stuff you've got to learn, and here are the services you go to. And you know what? If you start missing church, we're going to put you under discipline. What? You mean I'm not free to do whatever I want? This is what's been going on in the American church setting for a while, and that in and of itself is a very long and interesting and complex history. So, Pajot mentioned in a story that Peterson and his wife came to a service, and yeah, baby, couple hours, a lot of standing. In some services, a lot of language you might not understand, and not something you just trot into every couple weeks as a nominal Catholic or a nominal Protestant. But Peterson is sort of refracted on the Christian scheme. So Calvinists see his rejection of progressivist optimism, of human perfectibility, and really like that. There was a great piece in a Rio magazine. There's the link right below. Activism and the Conflict of Visions. Refers to Thomas Sowell's classic work, A Conflict of Vision, and talks about the unconstrained vision and the constrained vision. This goes back in many ways to Augustine. How perfectible, how much can we improve ourselves? And this is where the degree to which 12 Rules for Life is a self-help book gets interesting, because how perfectible can we be? Now, Peterson kind of has it both ways. On one hand, he says, you don't know, but get in there and try. But on the other hand, you're still going to be a mess. And Peterson really kind of balances these two voices. But when Calvinists listen to him, and you'll see that I've had some conversations with other Christian Reformed pastors, Calvinists hear this and say, hey, this person is speaking our language. Now, evangelicals see him, and Jordan Peterson is an individualist, and in many ways, Jordan Peterson reflects an evangelical style of Western remodification. There's tension within the evangelical community on this, because they want to get their people elected, and they want to back Trump so they can get their judges, and all of these kinds of things. But evangelicals imagine saving the world one person at a time. And so Jordan Peterson's individualist method to have all of these buccos come down from the stands and shake his hand and say, I cleaned up my room and you really helped my life, and I'm sorting out my relationship with my parents, and you've really helped me. Well, he's a clinical psychologist. This is what he's doing. And now he's helping thousands of people at once. This is great stuff. But now evangelicals have been doing this for a long time. Billy Graham would come through and hold a crusade, and he networked with the churches. And just as I am without one plea, and you come down forward and you get saved, and then you join the church, and guess what? Yeah, just as you were, but the church isn't going to leave you there. Okay, you need to quit smoking, and you need to quit drinking, and you need to stop having sex with your girlfriend, and you need to start coming to church every week, and you need to start tithing. And some people who went down to the Billy Graham thing felt a little bait and switch, because you said, I thought it was by faith alone, but now you're giving me all these rules to live by. Well, 12 rules for life. So these kinds of issues get engaged. Bernie Schiff noted he wanted to buy a church a few years ago. When I heard that, I thought, of course. This is Jordan Peterson's evangelical side. His book tour is something like an evangelical crusade. He's looking to save people one life at a time. But now, don't forget that Peterson grew up in the mainline church in the middle of the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the West employed God to help them fight against godless communism. I get a lot of very good emails and messages from someone, and I'm not going to dox you all who send me your emails, and some of you I'll have conversations with, but here's an email from someone who made some great points, and I'm just going to read parts of this email that he sent me. To me, the main argument of the Aaron Wolf piece I sent you is that Peterson is part of the tail end of the Enlightenment story rather than a new chapter in the Christian story. Who knows? I see Peterson as a believer in the liberal project. He sees the value in Christian stories, myths, and archetypes as a hoped-for remedy to the stalling out of the liberal story, and is an escape route from the left and right tyrannies. I think that's dead on right. I am someone who believes that apart from the tiny fringes, we are all liberals now, left, center, and right. That's right, I think he's right. With the exception of believers in a religious faith whose faith is primary and not merely an element of their liberalism. A small percentage, I would think, of the Christians and other believers in the U.S. I would think that the Christian story is nested in the liberal story for most contemporary Christians. There is a lot of truth to that. We've got all these layers, and if you don't believe me, meet Christians from the non-Western world and notice the differences. Although Western culture, or as Scott Alexander would say, universal cultures, just keep steamrolling the world. Peterson wants continued success for the liberal story. I think he believes it to be the last best hope for the West and all mankind. This is how Peterson is both liberal, classical liberal, and conservative. That's because we're using the words in two different ways. And in the material sense, he seems to be right, at least till now. He is open, as a fellow searcher, I believe, to the possibility of revelation in a top-down sense. That's his open agnosticism, but liberalism is, for now, his God. What a contrast to the late Christopher Lasch, a figure who you are no doubt familiar with, not as familiar as I should be, who saw liberalism as a corrosive that had broken down human community at all levels. Read Bowling Alone. Lasch, the former radical, hoped that we would somehow use the wisdom of our Christian past to combat the liberal rot. I think in some ways Jonathan Haidt is in there too. But he saw Christianity in modernity as unbelievable. I made mention, I found on the meaningoflife.tv, Wright having a conversation with Glenn Lowry, and Glenn Lowry talking about how he gave up his evangelical faith because he finally couldn't believe in the miraculous or the supernatural. That is an outstanding video to watch. Like Peterson, he wanted to use Christian history, symbol, morality, but for Lasch, there is no recovering belief. An odd belief, and again, that's Glenn Lowry, an odd belief for someone who was a critic of progress without limits and hoped for a kind of restoration. And that, again, is very much where Peterson is at. Now comes Peterson, who is using science and Darwin to mine the wisdom of our Christian past in support of liberal ends. Would Lasch have been appalled or encouraged? Maybe some of each, but certainly appalled that Peterson's goal was the continued good health of ameliorative liberalism rather than a return to community, whatever that would look like outside of the church in our industrialized world. And even the church is mostly colonized by liberalism, industrialism. Peterson is an earnest scientist who thinks the scientifically demonstrable parts of the moribund world of Christian faith can be rescued by a proper application of technique. I continue to follow Peterson in hopes that my Lasch-like despondency can be transformed. Glenn Lowry would love again to believe that his beloved wife, who has passed into death, that maybe there's an afterlife. Steve Jobs wistfully tells his biographer, I hope that there's something next, but they can't believe. And a number of you have written me with similar stories, and I'm working this through in my mind, and I'm praying for you. Be terrified. He's praying. I remember, I should finish this before I get too distracted. I thank Peterson for giving my pilgrimage new direction in spite of his bowing down to the liberal God. Outstanding email. And I won't dox you. You knew who you are. I remember when during college, I used to work in a lumber yard. That's my summer job. And I went out on delivery with a guy because we had some big windows to deliver. And I sat down for lunch with him in a restaurant, and I bowed my head to pray. And he looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm praying." He said, "Don't do that again." As I was working this through, I couldn't help but think about how did we get here? And many of you might notice that I've mentioned this nearly unreadable book by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. See, Peterson and Harris are in the same stream, and Charles Taylor has some very interesting ideas about how this stream has changed us. And so what I want to do is play a little bit about now hopefully this won't get flagged by the YouTube machine. I seem to be able to get away with audiobooks on a fairly regular basis. So I'm gonna play a little bit because Dennis Holland is a better reader than I am. But Providential Deism, how did we get here? Why is belief so difficult and fraught by doubt now? So let's listen to it. We'll begin at Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, chapter 6.
5. The Specter of Idealism.
No!
Part 2. The Turning Point. 6. Providential Deism. Let us return now to the main line of our story. How did an exclusive humanism become a live option for large numbers of people, first among elites and then more generally?
Exclusive humanism is something synonymous with Sam Harris, okay? It's Sam Harris's assertion that these religious beliefs, that's not exactly exclusive. It's secularism. Let's use that word.
Generally. The genesis comes about through an intermediate stage, which is often referred to as deism. There are many facets of this, and I want to single out 3 in the chapters of this part. The first turns around the notion of the world as designed by God. This understanding, which of course is perfectly orthodox as a general notion, goes through an anthropocentric shift in the late 17th and 18th century. I will call the upshot of this shift Providential Deism. The second facet of deism is the shift towards the primacy of impersonal order.
Notice how comfortable we are with impersonal order, how Star Wars can use the Force, but then they keep cheating because once you use the Force, the personal colonizes the impersonal, and Avatar can't. They give up the movie when Eula starts fighting for you.
Order. God relates to us primarily by establishing a certain order of things whose moral shape we can easily grasp.
Now, listen to the celebrity atheists. That's exactly what they say. Now, they take God out of it, but there's a certain order of things, the moral shape we can easily grasp. That's what they say.
Can easily grasp if we are not misled by false and superstitious notions.
That right there is Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty. Right there.
We obey God in following the demands of this order. We see a third facet of deism.
Now obviously they take God out, but this is why I said certain modernists, and I know a number of you want me to define fundamentalism. That gets complicated, okay? I'm not really talking about how conservative a religious belief is. I'm more talking about the philosophical assumptions that the modernist fundamentalist feud in the late 19th and early 20th century shared. And these philosophical assumptions gave birth to the conflict that they engaged in, because both shared philosophical assumptions about epistemology and representation, okay? And so that's why certain kinds of Christians look a lot like certain kinds of atheists, because they're sharing a philosophical substrate, even though they're no God, but they're sharing this philosophy.
Of deism in the idea of a true, original, natural religion, which has been obscured by accretions and corruptions, and which must now be laid clear again. 1. We saw above how the discourse of the modern moral order reshaped the understanding of providence. It led, in a sense, to an economistic view of it. But the change, which is fateful for the story I'm following here, is the narrowing of the purposes of divine providence. God's goals for us shrink to the single end of our encompassing this order of mutual benefit He has designed for us. Of course, a crucial feature of God's order, deriving from the very way in which we discover and define it, is that it is directed to the good of the creatures which make it up, and especially ourselves. This is not new in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it had always been thought that God had further purposes as well in His creation, that these were largely inscrutable, but that they included our love and worship of Him. So that a recognition of God and our dependence on Him places immediately on us a demand which goes beyond human flourishing.
Okay, that is a crucial paragraph. And you can see the roots of moralistic therapeutic deism. You can, in many ways, see, I remember talking to a woman who came to faith in a Pentecostal church and started coming to my church. And one day she says to me, God doesn't bring bad things into our lives. I thought, she wasn't raised on the Heidelberg Catechism. She doesn't understand providence of God. And I said, well, how do bad things come into our lives? Because, I'm a pastor. Pastorally, you're almost always better off asking questions. Well, the devil brings those things into you. Okay. So, I didn't say this to her, but is it a dualism? Suddenly then you have Christianity as a dualism. And part of the difficulty of talking about Christianity is that it's a jungle out there, and a lot of people believe a lot of different things, and some of you are writing me telling me how wrong I am on some of my things, which is absolutely fine. I'm wrong on lots of things. Maybe you're right. That's cool. I'm cool. But in the older version, there was the assumption, the older Christianities, the older versions of Christianity, there was the assumption that it isn't just about us. And so part of my theory about what happened in this mix, that Charles Taylor, I don't know how well he talks about this directly, but you have God and us, and these are two moving targets as we go from the 15th to the 20th century. The problem of evil, you can find this in, I believe this is in Tim Keller's book on pain and suffering, which is, I think, Tim Keller's best book. His book on marriage is probably his second best book. But the problem of evil grew in prominence not necessarily because God changed, our view of God changed, but because our view of ourselves and our importance changed. We grew bigger, and, humanism, we began basically to displace God. And then God gets problematic. Well, what do you mean problematic? Problematic emotionally. I don't like this about God. I don't want this about God. And as our technology and our power grows, we seem to be gods on earth.
But now a striking anthropocentric shift occurs around the turn of the 17th, 18th centuries, give or take a couple of decades. We can in fact get a fuller view of this shift if we discern 4 directions of change in it, each one reducing the role and place of the transcendent.
Part of the reason Charles Taylor's book is so long is he does this all the time. Here's 3 things, and within this, 4 things, and within that, 2 things. The dude has read a lot.
Transcendent. Now, the first anthropocentric shift comes with the eclipse of this sense of further purpose, and hence of the idea that we owe God anything further than the realization of His plan, which means fundamentally that we owe Him essentially the achievement of our own good. This was formulated by Tyndall in his Christianity as Old as the Creation, a title which itself reflects the third facet of deism, the appeal to an original natural religion. For Tyndall, God's purposes for us are confined to the encompassing of the common interest and mutual happiness of His rational creatures. Now, Tyndall was an extreme case, and not many agreed with his book when it came out in the early 18th century. Tyndall went all the way, while I am talking about a trend here. But Tyndall was far from alone in giving voice to this trend. There were the Huguenot exiles in Holland, Jean Leclerc and Jacques Bernard. Somewhat later in France, the Abbé de Saint-Pierre adopted the position that the practice of virtue was the only form of cult worthy of God. The goals of religion and politics are the same. L'observation de la justice et la pratique de la bienfaisance. The abbé, whose outlook was immensely influential, coined this term bienfaisance, which became a key notion of the Enlightenment. His favorite appellations for God were indeed l'être souverainement bienfaisant and l'être infiniment bienfaisant. But beyond those who subscribed to these unambiguous formulations, even people who held to orthodox beliefs were influenced by this humanizing trend. Frequently, the transcendent dimension of their faith became less central.
Now again, we're talking about a process here, or for you Canadians who you don't need the French translated, a process. This is something happening slowly where, well, bit by bit, God in a sense has delegated his work into an impersonal nature. There's an impersonal strata between us and God. God is in a sense moving away, further away.
The second anthropocentric shift was the eclipse of grace. The order God designed was there for reason to see. By reason and discipline, humans could rise to the challenge and realize it. Now, even those orthodox thinkers in the past who might have agreed with such a high view of the power of reason would have wanted to add at this point that the full measure of goodwill required for carrying out the program of rational discipline, given our fallen condition, required God's grace. Without this always being denied, it fades in the spiritual climate I'm calling deist.
Now, what I believe he means by grace here is, again, the older assertion, and this comes through very strongly in the Augustinian tradition, that we are incapable of rescuing ourselves. We are incapable of saving ourselves. And so what God does is save us. Now, what happens, what he's saying is that bit by bit by bit, through reason, people can save themselves. Now, again, if you listen to Sam Harris, this is what he's saying. Here's the thing. If you read this, you begin to recognize, boy, Sam, you sound a lot like these Christians back then. They had God, but their program was pretty much your program. All you do is take out God, and you have the same program. And Sam says, no, genetic fallacy. No, I think Charles Taylor has a point here, Sam, and I think he's read a lot more books than you. Not that necessarily means something.
God still has a role, of course. Indeed, he often is given two. First, he made us and endowed us with reason, and in some cases also with benevolence, and it is these faculties which enable us to get things together and carry out his plan. And secondly, in case this didn't suffice, he stands at the end of time as judge, promising to distribute rewards of unimaginable joy and punishments of unspeakable agony. And these will concentrate our minds on the task at hand.
So here you have, in many ways, the Gomarist versus Remonstrant battle that brought forth the canons of Dort. Now we're talking Reformed history. We have the Calvinists and the Arminians, and the question and the challenge of Calvinists against Arminians of semi-Pelagian. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, I don't want to go into this whole ancient fight because I don't want to go into that now, but this is what it's about. How has God, when God gives us the Bible, does he simply give us the tools to fix ourselves? That would be the semi-Pelagian position. Or are we saved by grace? God does this in spite of ourselves. And then you get into all these knotty questions of election and predestination and all of those things that a number of you really enjoy writing me about.
On the task at hand. Authors differed on whether they relied more on inherent benevolence or on the rewards and punishments. Locke stands at one extreme. He sees us as being so susceptible to being driven from the path of right reason by sloth, covetousness, passion, ambition, superstition, and bad education and customs, that God has acted providentially in establishing and publishing, through revelation, such rewards and pains, without which we wouldn't be able to muster the motivation to comply.
That's John Locke, of course.
The philosophers, indeed, showed the beauty of virtue. They set her off and drew men's eyes and approbation to her. But leaving her unendowed, very few were willing to espouse her. But now there being put into the scales on her side an exceeding and immortal weight of glory, interest is come about to her, and virtue now is visibly the most enriching purchase, and by much the best bargain. It has another relish and efficacy to persuade men, that if they live well here, they shall be happy hereafter. Open their eyes to the endless, unspeakable joys of another life, and their hearts will find something solid to move them. Upon this foundation, and upon this only, morality stands firm, and may defy all competition. This position repelled others, for instance, Shaftesbury, and after him Hutcheson, and they insisted rather on the force of the motives of love, benevolence, and solidarity within us. This second variant gains ground throughout the century, in keeping with the decline of hell, the greater and greater reluctance to accept traditional beliefs about an implacable, punishing God. But in neither one form or the other is there a role for grace.
In other words, both these avenues are about, well, how can we achieve this? And Locke is looking at, well, we have all these things encumbering us, so we need to build structures. And when you listen to Sam Harris talk about, well, how people are irrational, how are you going to make them rational? We need to build structures to enable people to be rational within. There's carrots and sticks. There's rewards and benefits. Now, the other side of it says, no, it's love. People are naturally loving. Motivate them by love. But grace isn't a picture in either side of this.
The third shift follows from the first two. The sense of mystery fades. Here again there is an extreme statement at the turn of the century. Toland's Christianity Not Mysterious, a book which was much excoriated and even burned by the public hangman in Ireland. But it too captured and pushed to its full conclusion a broader trend which others were reluctant to articulate. This in a way follows from the other two changes and the general way in which natural order is understood. If God's purposes for us encompass only our own good, and this can be read from the design of our nature, then no further mystery can hide here. If we set aside one of the central mysteries of traditional Christian faith, that of evil, of our estrangement from God and inability to return to Him unaided, but we see all the motivation we need already there, either in our self-interest well understood or in our feelings of benevolence, then there is no further mystery in the human heart.
And this is where, again, if you listen to Sam Harris, well, there's no mystery about good and bad. We know good and bad. We feel well-being. And, well, maybe meaning and consciousness, there's some stuff in, but this isn't hard. And if we only align everything together, we'll be great. And this is why Peterson says you're not taking into account the heavy hitters, as Peterson says, like Dostoevsky and the Underground. The piano key argument that you give people everything they want, they'll screw it up. Why are the suicide rates in the affluent West more than you would imagine coming from the slums of Latin America, Africa, or Asia? What's that tell us about us? And so, again, you have this question of, this is why I think what happens between the 15th and the 20th century is that our estimation of ourselves grows. And we imagine, as we imagine we don't need God, God recedes. And I think pastorally we see this because, well, when do people tend to convert? Well, when they need Him. Now you can look at this cynically and say, oh yeah, duh. They can't do it on their own. And you can be Jesse Ventura and say, well, religion is for weak people. Well, let me tell you something. Y'all gonna be weak at some point. Nobody gets out of this world alive.
Human heart. That other great niche of mystery, God's providence, has also been emptied. His providence consists simply in his plan for us, which we understand. Particular providences, unforeseeable interventions in specific cases, have no more place in the scheme, no more than miracles. Indeed, if God is relying on our reason to grasp the laws of his universe and hence carry out his plan, it would be irresponsible of him and defeat his purpose to be intervening miraculously. If God were to adjust laws to particular cases, then this would immediately supersede all contrivance and forethought of men, and all prudent action, as Hutcheson argues. The fourth shift came with the eclipse of the idea that God was planning a transformation of human beings, which would take them beyond the limitations which inhere in their present condition. In the Christian tradition, this has usually been expressed in terms of humans becoming partakers in the life of God. The Greek fathers, followed by the Cambridge Platonists, spoke of theosis, a becoming divine, which was part of human destiny. This prospect is, in a sense, a counterpart to the demand to go beyond merely human flourishing. The call to love God and love creatures in the fulsome way that God does is matched by the promise of a change which will make these heights attainable for us.
And if you listen to Jonathan Pageau, and he talks about orthodoxy and the Greek fathers, this is what you'll hear. But now pay attention, the role of grace. This is not something we attain for ourselves. This is the work of God. And when you look at the kind of the tug of war that you have between the Roman Catholic tradition and Protestantism with respect to purgatory, there's a lot in this too, because especially Calvinists want to emphasize this perfection is God's work. Now, does that mean we have no part to play? No, we have our part to play. But how do we find language that actually dissects what's our part and God's part? We probably can't, partly because I think we're just bad at talking about agency, and our view of looking at agency, just even within human conception, is severely limited and fraught. But again, what Charles Taylor here is noting the path from which everyone believed in God. Now, a lot of you out there was, well, if everyone believed in God, well, don't get too excited about that, because for most of human history, everyone believed in God, and that didn't necessarily make people great, okay? It's, we're way more complicated than that. Well, I believe there's a God. Well, what does that mean about you? You go to prison. A lot of people in prison believe in God. It's just believing in God isn't really what we're talking about. So, but again, Charles Taylor is going from, 1500, everybody believed in God, to 21st century where people are like, you don't really need to believe in God. I think science and stuff explains everything just great.
For us. This prospect survives longest as an account of the afterlife. The transformation, which will take us beyond our limitations in this life, will be realized in another life after death. Figures like Butler and Kant, for instance, hang on to this vestige of the traditional Christian doctrine, even when they have given ground on some of the other shifts. In this form, of course, the doctrine of transformation is safely insulated from Christian life in this world, being quite relegated to the next. What underlay these shifts? There were many factors at the time which undoubtedly helped to explain it, always remembering that the explanations offered here will be of the partial and fragmentary type I mentioned above. Chaunu has talked about the high tides of religious fervor and controversy, which after a century and a half of intense flow begin to ebb. We are familiar with this kind of fatigue reaction from powerful ideological mobilization in our own century. Something of the kind seems to have been taking place in the latter part of the 17th century in both England and France. The leading classes of both countries began to have less and less sympathy for aggressive religious partisanship. Tolerance was more and more an accepted norm. The general European reaction to Louis's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 showed it to be quite out of tune with powerful currents of European elite opinion. More particularly, the English had cause to reflect on the costs of intense partisanship after their Civil War. The Restoration sees a reaction against fanaticism and enthusiasm. At the same time, partly for this reason, and partly perhaps because of the success of the new science, there was an insistence on a simpler, doctrinally less elaborated religion, and one more accessible to reason.
And again, you can see this in sensitivities, especially in the 20th century in terms of the mainline.
All these factors played a role, but I do not think that they can fully illuminate the fourfold anthropocentric shift I've been describing. It is certain that religious fervor fell off among the leading strata of many European countries. A certain skepticism, even a scoffing attitude, could be discerned in many a coffee-house conversation or salon. It was this general climate rather than widespread, unambiguously espoused unbelief which explains the sense we frequently meet among concerned clergy and other serious believers that they had an important apologetic task on their hands. Major figures like Boyle and Clark were concerned to produce solid proofs of the existence and goodness of God. Butler's writings were largely apologetic in intent. Indeed, Butler, in his charge to his diocesan clergy in 1751, speaks of the general decay of religion in this nation, which is now observed by everyone and has been for some time the complaint of all serious persons. The number of those who think seriously about these issues, Butler declared, and who profess themselves unbelievers, increases, and with their numbers, their zeal. Real unbelievers, such as the world knows in profusion today, that is, people who clearly in their own mind reject a belief in God, were not all that numerous in 1751, though the few who fit the description were highly placed. Butler was reacting to a decline in zeal, even a disaffection with religion, but this has existed in many epochs in history without bringing about an actual rise in a rival belief system. More significant, as Michael Buckley points out in his penetrating book, is the fact that the great apologetic effort called forth by this disaffection itself narrowed its focus so drastically. It barely invoked the saving action of Christ, nor did it dwell on the life of devotion and prayer, although the 17th century was rich in this. The arguments turned exclusively on demonstrating God as creator and showing his providence. Whence this narrowing? I believe it reflects, in part, the hold of the new idea of moral order. It was perhaps more than understandable that, after the terrible struggles around deep theological issues to do with grace, free will, and predestination,
that's this great struggle that happens that again bears fruit in the great Calvinist versus Arminian struggles.
Many people should hunger for a less theologically elaborate faith which would guide them towards holy living. The Cambridge Platonists made this kind of plea, but so also did such figures as Jeremy Taylor, Tillotson, and Locke. What is significant is that the plea for a holy life came to be reductively seen as a call to center on morality, and morality in turn as a matter of conduct.
Now also notice, again, if you go back to the Unbelievable podcast where Richard Dawkins was on, how amiable Richard Dawkins is to these two religious people. Well, you're not the kind of religious person that I'm concerned about. Well, what's he cares about? He cares about politics. Bernie Schiff calls Jordan Peterson a dangerous man. Why? He might go into politics. Well, you're revealing exactly where you think the action is.
As a matter of conduct. As we move from the Cambridge Platonists through Tillotson to Locke and the 18th century, apologetics, and indeed much preaching, is less and less concerned with sin as a condition we need to be rescued from through some transformation of our being, and more with sin as wrong behavior which we can be persuaded, trained, or disciplined to turn our backs on. This concern with the morality of correct conduct has been observed by many historians of the period. Religion is narrowed to moralism. This morality in turn was cast in terms of the modern notion of order, one in which our purposes mesh to our mutual benefit. Self-love and social were ultimately at one. That this harmony had been wrought by God in His providence was a key part of apologetics. As Tillotson put it, "And nothing is more likely to prevail with wise and considerate men to become religious than to be thoroughly convinced that religion and happiness, our duty and our interest, are but one and the same thing, considered under different notions."
Now, if you watch, for example, I've been my wife is a teacher. She's got to teach American history, and so we've been watching the HBO series done in 2008 on John Adams. And if you watch things from that period, and very much the colonial period, well, Christianity and patriotism, they're one and the same. And this endures into the Cold War. To be a good American citizen meant going to church. So Jordan Peterson's parents, what was his father, a school teacher? Jordan Peterson's parents brought little Jordan to church, and little Jordan had to go to Sunday school. Now, 12 or 13, Jordan's decided to buck it. The parents aren't going to take it that seriously. Okay, Jordan, you can stay home by yourself. But during the Cold War and way into the colonial period, to be an upstanding citizen meant you go to church. It was very waspy. It was very, at least in terms of Northwestern Europe and the United States, it was very American. And so the Roman Catholics and the Jews, they were suspects. The Muslims, they were just exotic. But, you know, it was very waspy and it was very moral. And so you sent your children to Sunday school for their morality.
An observer today looks with stupefaction on this pre-shrunk religion, anticipating the root and branch rejection from both sides, by Wesley from one direction and later secular humanists from the other. How could it be conceived thus narrowly? A common explanation often given here is the demands of reason. It is certainly true that Restoration clerics appealed frequently to reason. It was a way of returning to a simpler, less theologically elaborate religion, which would give less purchase to divisive disputes. Through reason, one could hope to define a compact core of unquestionable belief. For the Anglican establishment, it might appear that reason would undercut their enemies on both sides, both Papist and Puritan, by refuting superstition and showing the groundlessness of fanaticism.
Now, don't forget Jonathan Edwards in the Americas basically writing a paper suggesting that the enthusiasm that was going on in the awakening was a legitimate expression by God. He was trying to defend this against others that said this was unreasonable. It's very hard to say that Jonathan Edwards was not a reasonable man.
Thomas Sprat, a strong clerical supporter of the Royal Society, argued that those who put their trust in implicit faith and enthusiasm might fear the advance of science, but our church can never be prejudiced in the light of reason, not by the improvements of knowledge, nor by the advancement of the works of men's hands. From whence may be concluded that we cannot make war against reason without undermining our own strength. With benefit of hindsight, we know how this kind of reasoning would be later turned against Sprat's church, but unless we accept a simple secularization thesis, that religion must retreat before reason, it is hard to see this as a cogent explanation for the narrowing of much official religion in his time. For one thing, reason does not have a single, unambiguous meaning. It was appealed to by the Cambridge Platonists also in an attempt to define a simpler, purer religion which would nourish holy living. But their account of reason had a place for an intuition of the divine. Of course, this Cartesian Platonic understanding was undermined by the success of the new natural science. But even if we accept the new account of knowledge, empirical and focused on the evidence of the senses, we still can't find sufficient ground for the exclusion of Christology, devotion, and religious experience from apologetics and much preaching. The new natural science did indeed threaten some of the outlying forms which had become intricated with religion, for example, the Ptolemaic system and the scholastic method. It did, of course, hasten the disenchantment of the world, helping to split spirit from matter. More seriously, its conception of exceptionless natural law would later raise questions about the possibility of miracles. But this by itself can't explain the turning from devotion and religious experience to an external moralism. True, the receding of Shonou's high tides meant that there was a falling off in devotion. But this still doesn't explain why what there was so often took this moralistic form. Why a figure, for instance, like William Law, whose devotional life was so reminiscent of the theocentrism of the 17th century, was such a marginal figure in the first half of the 18th, until the preaching of Wesley, who admired him, brought something of this life of prayer back to the forefront. The early modern period.
This it's a long book, okay, but I think you get the impression that what's happening here with Peterson and Harris is not devoid of this long story. Now, Peterson has mentioned Charles Taylor's book. I don't know that Harris has mentioned. I don't know that Harris has read it. It is not an easy book. It is not an easy read. But you know, when I read this and I listen to this, I think, yeah, well, where does Sam Harris come from? Sounds a lot like here. Now, this again is where Jordan Peterson is sort of a conservative. He's attempting to arrest what he sees as the corruption of a cultural accomplishment. And this is what draws fire from progressives who demand change along the lines of group identity. That's the whole culture war aspect of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. But Jordan Peterson, the area of his work which is far more interesting to me in terms of the religious conversation, you see, the main line sort of retired God number one as the Cold War grew to a close. Remember, God number one and God number two had always been with us, and there was a lot more commonality when it came to God number one. God number two is where things really got particular and where the religious groups really started to go to war. But God number one hung in there, and there was a lot that the groups could believe in about God. The God of the philosophers, the God of the background context, the God that is, you know, God as opposed to all of the names that particular groups would have of God, and then the narratives that were basically the heart of the religions that they were asserting. As the main line receded, the evangelicals doubled down on God number two. Now, this is an interesting move, and I think I can show it, because look at what happens in the 70s during Watergate and the fallout from Vietnam as the institutional trust went out from these institutions that were there to fight the Cold War. God number two really roars into being, and this comes in through the moral majority, and it comes in through Chuck Colson. Now, I hadn't read this book until a couple of years ago, but it's kind of nice that I read it so late in life because it reminded me of the 70s. Now, I was born in the early 60s, and so my memory of the early 70s isn't all that good. But it's a cultural fit for the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate skepticism. Chuck Colson, like Jordan Peterson and like so many others during the Cold War, was a moral, dutiful man who went to church. Now, his moral dutifulness didn't keep him from doing the kinds of things he did for Richard Nixon. He was a company man, and he was Nixon's hatchet man. He would do anything for Richard Nixon, and he was about to take the fall for it. And what he discovers is a personal relationship in Jesus Christ and how this changes him. And if you read this book is in many ways, how to describe it in a way that this book so epitomizes a religious moment in America of enthusiasm, of personal identity. Now here's the risk that I run. Nobody likes anybody poking around their axioms. And when I talk about the cultural moments that lead to a revival such as this, I don't do so to undermine the legitimacy of the revival. And I think this is a fundamental confusion that Christians often make. And again, this is why some of you say, well, where do you get your theology from, Vanderklay? Well, maybe read some Herman Bavinck, because that's where my tribe gets it from. And Bavinck and Kuyper come of age in this day when liberalism, late 19th, early 20th century liberalism is really taken hold. And Bavinck and Kuyper come around and look at liberalism and critique it. And they can say on one hand two things, and this is, I think, where my tradition is most strong, and you can find this in a place like Calvin College. I know, once I name names, it gets controversial. But we have two books. God moves through history. God comes at us from above and below. And I'm not denying the above. See, to deny the above kind of puts you in the liberal camp. To deny the below kind of puts you in the evangelical camp. I'm not going to give way on either thing. God comes at us from above and below. Now, Peterson's coming from below. Bavinck was not afraid to talk about organic inspiration of Scripture. So I'm not in any way trying to undermine or cheapen Chuck Colson's conversion because it aligns with this moment in history and makes sociological sense as well as religious sense. And this is the sense I'm trying to make out of Jordan Peterson. But Colson typifies a moment, a transitional, a pivotal moment in American Christianity, in American Christendom, in the American culture, where the institutions of American life that brought victory in the Second World War and brought us through the Korean War suddenly get shaken in Vietnam and the Cold War. Can we trust these institutions? Well, from above, then. So we've got tremblings from below. And so Chuck Colson, the church I grew up in, the mainline church, Jesus wasn't alive there. And now Chuck Colson is having an experience of a living God. And so now some people have likened what I'm doing with Francis Schaeffer and likened Jordan Peterson with Francis Schaeffer. I don't know if that one really works, but I'm not going to give up on from below or from above. And so Chuck Colson says, I've got questions from below, but God came down on me from above. And in a sense, Jonathan Edwards was doing the same thing in his cultural moment. So Chuck Colson is going to be controversial because then he becomes a hallmark of the religious right. And again, my particular, I'm over in the Christian Reformed left, but now I'm part of this. Am I a part of the intellectual dark web? I don't know. Who's keeping a list? Am I a pastor of the intellectual dark web? I don't know. But I'm kind of like the Weinstein brothers and disaffected with the left because of where they've been going things. You know, it gets terribly complicated to talk about this stuff. But Chuck Colson becomes this pivotal moment. And in a sense, what happens is, culturally, is God number two gets emphasized without God number one. And it plays to a culture getting increasingly subjective and increasingly trouble with what is from below. And I think David Brooks addresses this moment well in The Road to Character, and these little biographies he does in that wonderful book. I really enjoyed David Brooks' book, The Road to Character. But you know, so now we have this other movement coming in of the sovereign secret self, where inside of me my identity is Shirley Temple, but Shirley Temple is trapped in a balding middle-aged man who can't dance to save his life because he grew up amongst Dutch Calvinists. But deep inside of me, I'm just Shirley Temple dying to get out. Well, why? How can you believe that? Well, I feel it to be true. Well, you know, Charles Colson, he lives. You ask me how I know he lives. How do you know he lives? He lives within my heart. I'm Shirley Temple deep down. There's a similarity there. I'm not trying to equate them, but this is a cultural moment where I can't trust religion from below, so I can only believe it from above. It's subjective. And this works in the American scene because have any religion you want as long as you keep it private. But now Sam Harris, we can't trust that. We got to get rid of these ideas. Well, this is the moment. God number 2 is big, and Sam Harris says, I don't like God number 2. We got to get rid of God number 2. And Peterson says, God number 1, he's important. Comes with an evolutionary non-evangelical argument. That's what Peterson is doing. He's reestablishing God number 1. And it comes at a time when there are real hunger and need for foundations. Now we've had a couple of generations where there's been so little foundation, and people come at us in this moment and say, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or man and woman does not pertain to me. I can be a man now and a woman later, and there's no connection between below the biology and my experience of myself as a God. That's the moment we're at. Is it any wonder that Peterson comes at this moment from below and says, hey, wait a minute, we can get here from below. Now read Jordan Petersonitis, which is Andrew Sweeney's. He wrote a great piece on Medium dealing with Jonathan Rowson's 12 points that he wrote in a PDF about Peterson. Read both of them. They're both fascinating, but look at how Rowson is grappling with this, and I think Sweeney hits him dead on. But this is the moment that we're dealing with. People are saying, well, on one hand, if you're on the left, you say, you can be any gender you want to be. But then you're also saying climate change is real. Well, I think unicorns followed by rainbows are going to take all the CO2 out of the air. And see, the left has these tensions within it, and they don't know what to do with it. And others who have been, well, should I feel guilty for being a heterosexual white male? So if the reaction in the other way. Now Peterson comes below and says, hey, wait a minute, we have science. Well, science is one of the last authorities left standing, and Peterson and others are saying, don't take away my science. Now, it's in a strange way because Rowson, brings in Trump, and of course Trump comes into the conversation like he storms into every conversation. Trump is the man who must not be named because once you name him, you can't say anything else. But look at Trump and Nixon now. I mean, Trump copies Nixon's Law and Order with, when he's elected in 2016, his inauguration in 2017. But Trump is the first post-foundationalist president. See, Trump doesn't spin things, because that imagines that there's something to spin. Trump is a hypnotist. Listen to Scott Adams. It doesn't matter that there's anything from below. It's winning that's important. And he simply talks without any concern for a correspondence theory of truth. No wonder he's driving Sam Harris nuts. This is post-foundationalism completely. Now, Peterson comes in and says, we have a foundation. I'm going to offer you a foundation. It's science. It's Darwin. It's evolution. And now the evangelicals, get nervous when they hear that. So he's not an evangelical. And so, well, Sam Harris, okay, he's not an evangelical. Religion, Christianity-ish, and the Bible have psychology, scientific foundations, and therefore science still has some cultural authority, should be heard. So he's a conservative and he's a liberal. He's both of those things. Let's not lose this good thing we've got going. He arises in the debate whether physical biology is respected in the public space. Does an M or an F on your driver's license have any correspondence to what is between your legs? These are the issues. These are the issues we're dealing with, above and below. And Peterson's coming from below and says, stuff matters. And Sam Harris says yes, and Peterson says, and we got to keep Christianity around, and Sam Harris says, what did he say? So now you have the intellectual dark web, and you've got a diversity of people within it, and they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? Well, what we're not going to do is get rid of science. They can all agree on that. Peterson says, and don't get rid of God. Which God? God number one. Him we can agree with. Him we can agree on. You almost got Brett Weinstein there. But then he says, well, and I'm open to God number two, because that might be important too. We don't really know. Peterson is trying to put the world back together. Okay? That's what I immediately saw when I began listening to the biblical series. I'm saying we have had a divorced world. We have Christians going to church on one hand on Sunday morning say, oh, the world is flat and it has a dome. And that's where the Genesis story plays. But when I walk out the door, the world is round and we're in a globe going through space. My world is divorced. Peterson is saying, here's a way we can put the world together. Now he's coming from below, and he says, well, there might be something above. And I'd like to say, let's come from below. Let's come from above. Let's put your world back together. Well, what is that going to take? What does it take to believe? Well, I think those are the really big and important questions. Can the physics verse and the story verse be put together? Can mind and matter be put back together? I should have gone all the way back to the first slide. Let's get there, get there, get there. There we are. Sam Harris asks questions Jordan Peterson can't answer. Now, Esther is an evangelical. She and I have differences of opinions on some things. But I agree with her, and I agree with Gordy Allen. Instead of belief or unbelief, now the conversation moves on to much more interesting question. What do you mean when you say God? And what I think is happening here is Jordan Peterson is bringing God. With Chuck Colson, God number two got large and in charge. Freddie wants me to plug our show. God number two gets large and in charge because of the evangelicals, and Sam Harris freaks out. Jordan Peterson comes along and says, but God number two really sits on God number one. Because, and I think Peterson is exactly right by that. Christianity has God number one and God number two, and they're all one God. God is both. Well, now, read Charles Taylor. And so my tradition of Christianity is pre-Enlightenment. And so read the Heidelberg Catechism, read the Belgic Confession. This unified world baked together. God speaks from two books. We're not going to have to choose between mind and matter. They all come together. So I hope this makes sense. I hope YouTube doesn't flag my playing of the audiobook with Charles Taylor. If it does, I'll be bummed. Anyway, hope this was helpful.